I am Leah Pariser, an interviewer for the Holocaust Oral History Project of the Orange County Whoops, you want to clean that up and start all over again? The Orange County Anti-Defamation League. Today is April 9th, 1995, and we're interviewing Henry Tebrich, who is a survivor of the Holocaust. And thank you very much for giving testimony, a very precious gift to all of us and future generations. And Henry, would you start by telling us your name and date of birth and where you were born?
My name is Henry Tebrich. That's T-E-B-R-I-C-H. My name at birth was Heinz Siegmund Tebrich, and I was born in Leisnig, that's L-E-I-S-N-I-G, in the state of Saxony, Germany, near Leipzig, and my date of birth is June 27, 1920. And I was born in a very small German town of about 10,000 inhabitants. But first I'd like to go a little back into the background of my family. My family name was first found in 1275 in a county near London, England. And then there's a gap which we can't cover. We don't know what happened, but there was a massacre in York, and a lot of Jews left England for Holland, France, Belgium, Germany, and even further east, Poland and even Russia. And the first date that we can actually go back to is my great-grandfather, Valentin, who was born in 1810 in Bamst, that was in the province Posen, now called Poznan because it was annexed by Poland after the First World War. My great-grandfather Valentine married Hannah Goldstein from the same province, and he had 3 children. One of them, Siegmund, was my grandfather. They moved to another town and eventually ended up in Dresden. And my grandfather opened a business in Kamenz, Saxony. By the way, my grandfather Siegmund was married to Helene Louise Rosam, who was born in Lissa, which was also in the province Posen. And they opened up this business in Kamenz. He retired from that business, moved to Dresden, and but didn't like retirement, and he opened another business, and this became the family business in Leisnig. They had 6 sons and 3 daughters. 5 were graduate university students. 2 were doctors, 1 was an engineer, and 2 were chemists. And the only one who didn't go to university was my father. He ended up in the business with my grandfather. Somebody had to pay for the studies of the other sons, and there were 3 aunts. The business in Leisnig was very prosperous. Leisnig was a small town of 10,000 inhabitants, but it had an industrial area, and it was surrounded by very wealthy farms. And these farmers were our customers. The business was a retail clothing store that sold also linens, and we did some manufacturing of dresses and aprons and linen covers for the feather beds. The merchandise was cut in our business, and some sewing was done there, but a lot of it was done in homework by outside workers. As I said, the business was very prosperous. The family was very respected. They participated in all local affairs. They were very charitable. They belonged to a lot of local organizations. My grandfather as well as my father were Freemasons. And in 1904, my father got married to my mother, Gertrude Jeanette Helft, who came from a nearby town. Her father, my grandfather, Ludwig, or short Louis, was in the same type of business as my parents. And my father bought out my grandfather, and my grandfather retired. I guess my mother's dowry must have helped with that. And we had a very, very warm household. My mother was busy in the business, so we had quite a household staff. We celebrated the Jewish holidays, but there was no synagogue or temple in our town, so my father had to travel to Dresden to attend services, and that was done on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It was about an hour's drive, and he stayed there overnight, and when I got bigger he took me along, and also my mother and my sisters. My mother and my sisters had to sit upstairs, and my father and I had the seat that had originally been owned by my great-grandfather. Eventually, in Germany, you did not pay the Jewish communities. There was a tax collected by the government that was then distributed to the Jewish communities. And politically, we did not belong to Dresden, so they didn't get any money from our taxes. And they threatened they would take my father's seat. But he told them that if they take his father's seat, they'd take all his memories away. And he paid for that extra anyway. And he would cease being a Jew. It worked. We could keep the seat. But I could not be bar mitzvah there. I had to be bar mitzvah in Leipzig, in another temple. I was bar mitzvah in 1933, and by that time I was in high school. Previously I had been in grade school in my hometown, then I was in high school. The high school years were not very, very good because it was under the Nazis, most of it. And I had to sit by myself, and I remember that on certain days the teachers all showed up in Nazi uniforms. The PE teacher was in the SS, and he marched us around the gym, and the students had to sing Nazi songs. Some of them were violently anti-Jewish. I hate to tell the words of the songs, and I didn't want to do that. So we found a friendly doctor who gave me a certificate that I was sick and I couldn't participate in PT any longer.
If you remember those, can you mention some of the words in the songs?
Yeah, when the Jewish blood spreads from the knife, and the Jews should be shot together with all the traitors, and it was not very pleasant. Oh, that's to say the least. Anyway, so I graduated from high school, and it was planned for me to take over the family business eventually, but it needed training, and at that time we didn't realize that Hitler was going to last as long as he did and was going to do the things that he did do to the Jews. We should have known, because he wrote it all in his book, which was called Mein Kampf, or My Battle, which he wrote when he was interned in a prison in Bavaria, a long time ago. But I want to go back to 1933, when Hitler came to power. They immediately had a boycott of all the Jewish stores. And we found in front of our store a group of Nazi thugs that had signs that people should not buy in Jewish stores. That lasted one day, and our business actually did not suffer from this. It suffered on that one day, but afterwards it went back to normal, and Germany had a lot of governments that didn't last very long, and they thought that the same thing would happen with Hitler. So that the time we had to suffer for a little bit, and then it would be over, and another government would come. But that wasn't so. I had 3 living sisters. There were actually 6 in our family, but 2 died in infancy. Wait a minute, I had 2 living sisters then. One died 12 years of age. My sister Erna was the oldest, and she was born in 1906, and she was studying medicine at the time, in 1933. And when it came to re-enroll, because they had to re-enroll every semester as they could change, they didn't have to stay at the same medical school. And they went to schools where there were famous professors in the field that they wanted to go into, and they changed every year. or every 6 months if they wanted to. So it was doubtful in 1933 that she could re-enroll in a German university. And the same happened to my cousin Walter, who I come to back later on, who was the son of my father's favorite mother, who was a physician in Hamburg. Walter was a chemistry student, also advanced student, and they had doubts that he could still enroll. So it was decided between my father and my uncle to send Walter to Edinburgh, Scotland, and to send Erna, my sister, to Basel, not to Basel, to Switzerland, anywhere, a German-speaking university in Switzerland. It was Zurich or Basel. She ended up in Basel. And we could at that time still send 750 marks a month study money, which was good, which was actually more than she needed. She was in Basel, Walter was in Edinburgh. The German universities gave credit for 2 semesters of foreign study, and they hoped within the 2 semesters Hitler would be gone and they would be back, but not so. Erna stayed in Basel until she received her medical degree, but she couldn't work in Switzerland. She could work in Switzerland, but she wasn't allowed to earn money. So she stayed for a while longer at university and worked there. And my mother kept on sending the 750 marks, but the Nazis stopped it. We couldn't send it anymore, so Anna had to come back to Germany. Walter was fortunate. He had an aunt in Watsonville, California, who helped out with the money that he couldn't get anymore from Germany, and he received his PhD at Edinburgh University and stayed there. My other sister, Leni, or Helen was her name, Leni was the short name, also studied medicine, but she was not in an advanced study course as my sister Erna had been, and it was decided she should stop. And she came and joined my mother in the business, which my mother had inherited from my father when he died in 1934. It started off as my grandfather's business. It was always carried under my grandfather's name of Sigmund Tebrich. And Leni had, for a while before she went to study medicine, been my father's secretary, and she knew the business. But then she said, Erna studies medicine, I want to study medicine too. And my father said, how can I stop her? She has the same right as Erna. And he sent her to university. But then she came back, and she was a great help to my mother, because she knew the administration part of the business inside out. And she worked for my mother. And I was sent to Cottbus, Cottbus, which was a very good town to me because I met my future wife there, Sonia. And I went to textile engineering college because everybody had to learn a trade to take over a business. You had to be a specialist, and that was about as close as I could come to the business in Leisnig. So I was sent there in 1937. And I studied at the textile engineering college. There was numerous classes for Jewish students. The universities and colleges still accepted Jewish students, but only a percentage of the total student population. And I think it was 1%, but I'm not sure. However, this college had a Swedish citizen as a president, and he was not that much afraid of the Nazis. The Nazis needed him because he was a capacity in his field. He gave the college a name. So they couldn't fire him that easily, and he took more chances. And there were, I think, 6 different courses in this college. 2 engineering courses and 4 others were technicians. And he said, I can't cut a Jew in half. Consequently, I allow 1 Jew for every class. That wasn't what the Nazis had meant. They wanted a percentage of the total student body, but he got away with it. And that's how I got into that college. I was there to the 8th of November. Oh, I should go back a little bit. I was also always crazy about having a car. And my mother had a car, but she didn't drive. My father learned to drive when he was 54 years old because we always had a chauffeur. but one of his brother-in-laws had learned to drive, and it was his ego. He had to learn to drive too. But he only drove on Sundays, and not every Sunday, only when we went around in the neighborhood. And it needed me to help him. So anyway, I had this little car. I was 16, and you only got a license in Germany with 18 years. But at 16, you could drive. You got an identity paper that allowed you to drive something with a very small engine. Now, that probably doesn't mean anything, but the engine had to be less than 250 cc. It was a little more than a very powerful lawnmower. Well, I got this three-wheel car, 2 wheels in the front, 1 in the back. It had front-wheel drive. It did have a sunroof and a huge fog light, but otherwise it was a little car. And with that, I went to school in Cottbus. There were very few of these things built because they were too expensive and nobody bought them.
How many miles an hour could you go in a car like that?
About kilometer at that time.
Yeah.
I would say about 50. If you had a good tailwind, you could go about 60. But it hardly used any gasoline. Anyway, I drove this until I was 18. Just before my 18th birthday, I drove home, which was about a 4-hour drive, and the only rear wheel I had collapsed. So I got stuck, and I called my mother, and she sent the chauffeur, who was some of a mechanic, and he fixed that rear wheel, and I could drive home. But I never touched the car anymore. I gave him the car. He could fix it up and use it for himself. By that time I was 18, and I passed a regular driving test, and I got a real car. It was a convertible. Now that was something better. I was still in Cottbus. Then came the 8th of November, and Cottbus was surrounded by secret airports, military airports, that had just been built. The Germans were actually not allowed to rearm, but they had built these secret airports, and they had, when you drove by them, you were not allowed to stop, and at night you had to turn off your headlights. And there were military posts there that enforced this. And these airports were not officially opened yet. I mean, they were secret, but they were not used yet or had not been taken over. And on the 8th of November, we expected that Hitler would come to inspect these new airports. There was a whole chain of them. There wasn't just one. That was in preparation for the war against Poland, which they knew was going to happen. The Poles didn't, but they did. The world didn't believe it. So something was wrong with my watch, and I had a rented room that I rented from a Jewish family in Cottbus. It was a very narrow house, and it was usual in Germany that on the ground floor they had businesses, stores, and then the upper floors were occupied as apartments. And my room faced the front, and my watch didn't work right. So the store on the ground floor was a jewelry store, owned by an old Nazi Party member. Now, these old Nazi Party members were members who had been in the party before Hitler came to power, when everybody joined. And they had special privileges. They were highly respected people by the Nazis because they considered them more loyal than the newcomers. And one of those people owned the store. Or he rented from the Jewish landlord, who had to give up his shoe business that was in there before. And as I said, my watch didn't work right, so I went into the store and I asked him to adjust the watch. And while he was adjusting the watch, he said to me, "Why don't you take off tomorrow and take a trip out of town?" I said, "I can't. The college semester has just started, and I can't afford to miss any classes." "Oh," he said, "it'll do you good. You need a vacation." I said, "I've just come back from a vacation." He said, "Do it." I wasn't going to do it. He didn't tell me any more. 5 o'clock the next morning, the 9th of November, the doorbell rings, and I lived on one floor, and my landlord and his family lived on the floor above. And the doorbell was in the hall and could be heard all over the house. Doorbell rings 5 o'clock in the morning, and I look out of the window into the street. This was the main business street in town. And there was a man standing out there, and he told me he wanted to talk to Mr. Jablonski, who was the landlord. But Jablonski was already coming down the stairs talking to the men, and the man was telling him that the synagogue was on fire, the Jewish businesses had been destroyed or were being looted, next door to us was a department store by the name of Schocken, S-C-H-O-K-E-N. I think the people now own a book publishing firm in Israel. And across the street was another department store. Now, this night watchman that rang the bell was from the Gentile department store. But he knew my landlord. My landlord had been born in this town and been well known in the family, well known in the city. And he wanted to tell him what had happened. So I said to my landlord, now I put this together with the story that the man had told me the night before. And I figured he knew something that he didn't want to tell me, but he wanted to warn me. He was a decent man, even though he was an old Nazi. But some of these old Nazis were not that happy with Hitler anymore after he came to power. So I said to my landlord, my car is parked in the parking lot around the corner. Let's go. We leave town. He said, I can't leave town. I have to stay with my family and protect them. And I still can see him sitting up on the top of the stairs to tell me that. I couldn't say anything to that. There was another Jewish student from the college who also entered there, and I asked him to come along. And he said, I didn't know where I was going. So he said to me, why don't we go and visit my parents? They lived about 50 kilometers, about 30 miles away from there, in a neighboring town called Sorau, which after the Second World War was annexed by Poland. And I said, well, for lack of anything else, let's go to visit your parents. But before I did that, I wanted to make sure that this night watchman had told us the truth. And I saw Kaufhaus Schocken, or department store Schocken, destroyed, which was next door to me. So this was the truth. And I went to the synagogue, and I saw the synagogue destroyed. The fire engine was there, and the firemen had aimed their hoses towards the burning synagogue, but the hoses were flat. They hadn't turned the water on. It was just going through the motion. I saw that. So then I said to my friend, or my colleague from the college, that we should go and warn the other Jewish students. So we took the car and we went around and warned them, but they didn't believe me. And they could have come with me. One of the Jewish students had a motorcycle. He could have taken somebody else with him, and the others could have come with me. Didn't believe me. They went to school. We went out of town, and we went to Sorau to his parents. And there was a foreign broadcasting station, radio station, that broadcast in German, and it was Radio Luxembourg. And we turned on the radio and listened to the news from Luxembourg. I had thought that this was strictly a local affair, because we anticipated Hitler would come and they wanted to show him something, and that's why the destruction was. But we heard from Radio Luxembourg that these actions were all over Germany. So I said to my friend, well, this is not a safe town to stay in. It was a little town, and they didn't have a synagogue, but they had a prayer room. And I said, I'm not going to stay here, and you better come with me. He said, no, I don't want to go away from my parents. Same story, I have to protect them. They were retired business people, lived in a very nice house. We had breakfast there. We weren't too hungry. And finally, I talked him into coming with me, but I had to promise him that I would bring him back within a short time, an hour or 2 hours. So for a while we drove around town, and we saw the destruction there too of the few Jewish stores that were still left. And then we drove to a city park, and we found a bonfire. We got closer to the bonfire, and he noticed that they were burning the Torah and the prayer books from his temple, and some of the furniture from his little prayer room that they had. And he started to cry. I mean, he was a grown man, but it's when you see that. And there were school children dancing around the fire, singing Nazi songs. So my reaction to that was, this is not a safe town either. I have to leave. I said he should come with me. And he said, no, he wouldn't. He wanted to go back to his parents. And I had promised him to take him back, so I said, I'll do that. But I won't park in front of your parents' house. I'll park a block away, and then you'll have to walk. So I did that. Then I took my car and I went back to Cottbus, to my college town. But I didn't, of course, go to the place I lived in. My best friend in college was a Greek. He came from Mytilene, or formerly known as Lesbos. He was not a lesbian. he was a, yes, in a way he was politically he was a lesbian, but not in the meaning that it has now. And when he saw me, he had tears in his eyes. He was not Jewish. He had tears in his eyes also. And he told me what had happened at the college. The Gestapo came into the college, arrested all the Jewish students. Those were the people that had not wanted to come with me, and taken them away, and he didn't know where. That was the story he knew. And he insisted that he should come with me so he could protect me. But I had to leave Cottbus right away. I shouldn't stay there at all. So I said, I can't take that upon myself to take you with me, because if they find out, you will certainly not be able to finish your career at the college. You will probably be deported, and you may end up in jail. I can't allow that. So he gave me his Greek flag to put on the car. Not that it would have helped a lot, but I'd do that. and first he offered me his passport. I said, that doesn't work because there's a picture of you in there, and it doesn't look like me at all. He was much taller and fair-headed, and didn't look like me at all. Anyway, so he understood that. But he was upset. So then I decided to drive to Dresden, where I had an aunt, my father's sister, or one of my father's sisters, who was married to a Gentile, who was a president of a bank, and had just recently been retired because he wouldn't leave his Jewish wife. Those were the alternatives. Leave your Jewish wife, you can keep your job, or don't leave your Jewish wife, and you're fired. But the stockholders of the bank and the board were very much were grateful to him, because he had built up this bank from a very small bank to a good-sized bank during the time that he was there, and they were very generous also with his retirement. In fact, he got a luxury limousine and a chauffeur for life that the bank paid for, and a very good pension, but he couldn't work anymore. And they lived in a very affluent area of Dresden in a very nice house. Well, I felt I might be safe there. I went there, and I could see that they were not very much favorable of having me there, that they were afraid. They were afraid that I'd been followed. There's something else I should mention. I had bought my car in Cottbus, and I had a Cottbus registration plate, and it was the same as everybody else's. Cottbus had very few Jewish-owned vehicles. In fact, the cars were not as plentiful in Germany as they are here. At the college, there were two students had cars, and one had a motorcycle in the whole college. The others came by streetcar. So I was in Dresden, and they were afraid of having me. They didn't say so, but I could see it. So I asked them to make a telephone call to my mother, and they were afraid to let me use the phone. Now, a lot of phones were tapped by the Gestapo, and that's what they were afraid of. And as I said, they thought I might have been followed, but I wasn't. And I didn't have a Jewish license plate. In Berlin, Jewish-owned vehicles had a Jewish license plate, so they could be easily recognized. And the Berlin district number was 1A, and then the Jewish license plate started with 350,000. If a license plate started with 350,000 and it was a Berlin license plate, the car was owned by Jews. My driver's license, I think, had a J in it, which meant Jewish. On that they could have recognized, so I had the passport. But anyway, I felt that I wasn't welcome with my aunt and uncle. Well, he didn't say anything. She sort of was jittery, and they didn't encourage me to call my mother, and didn't allow me to call my mother. So I felt I should leave, and I should take the car and go to my hometown, the town I was born in, which was about an hour away from there. The town was between Leipzig and Dresden, in the middle. I drove there, but I didn't go to our house. We had an employee with us who had been with us since quite a bit before I was born. a very loyal employee. And I talked to them, and I told them what happened, what I had seen, and the news from Luxembourg. Now, this employee wasn't Jewish. And I was told they were very surprised. They said, nothing like that has happened here. In fact, they told me that our business had been opened until regular closing time, and there were some customers in the store, and that my sister Erna had been taken to this railroad station by the chauffeur because she was going to go to Leipzig to visit a dear friend of hers who was terminally ill in that Jewish hospital there. But she had called back that she wouldn't come back that night. She had made arrangements to be picked up at the railroad station. And she'd call when she wanted to be picked up, maybe the next day or the day after. Hearing the news that nothing had happened in Leipzig, I went to my mother's house. But I felt that maybe the little town that we lived in had been forgotten and the things would happen the next day. So I told my mother, I'll stay overnight. By that time it was late. That was still on the 9th. That was on the 10th of November, pardon me. No, wait a minute. That was on the 9th of November still. I traveled to Zora, I traveled back to Cottbus, I traveled to Dresden, I traveled to Leipzig. It was the 9th of November, the same day this all happened. And I said to my mother, I want to go to Hamburg. My father had two brothers and the widow of another brother in Hamburg. And Hamburg was an international town that did a lot of foreign trade with a lot of foreign ships. And the Nazis didn't really want to publish this to the outside world, what they were doing. So I felt that is the safest town, and I will have somewhere to stay. And my mother wasn't very fond of traveling by car. She rather went in a train and a sleeper, long distances. I said, oh, that's much too far to go by car. I said, well, we won't go on a train, we'll go by car, but I'll stop somewhere. Finally she agreed, and next morning about 5 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock we left. My car, not hers. And we went to Leipzig. And in Leipzig we went to the apartment of an acquaintance, not a friend, an acquaintance. But we didn't go in, and as my mother was leaving the car, we saw our acquaintance being brought out by two men who were obviously Gestapo, and they just arrested him. So I said to my mother, no need to go here, I don't even want to stay. So my mother said, let's go and see Erna in the hospital. We went to the Jewish hospital, and I stayed in the car. My mother went in. And the reason why my sister Erna had stayed there was that she was bandaging healthy people and putting them to bed. Because the Nazis didn't arrest people who were heavily bandaged, because it would have been too cumbersome for them to take them to the camps. So my sister bandaged a lot of people and told them which rooms to go into and which beds, and then they were sleeping all over the halls and everything. But she saved, at that time, their people's lives, or prevented arrest of these people.
How did she know that?
I guess other people knew, and they told her, and she was asked to do that. She was not an employee of the hospital. I mean, she had nothing to do with that hospital. In fact, she couldn't practice. But she could put bandages on people. So this is what she was doing while she hadn't come home. But she didn't want to say that over the telephone, because, a lot of telephones were listened to. So anyway, she stayed there. And my mother, seeing all this, agreed that we would go to Hamburg, but we should stop in a town called Schöneberg, which was near Magdeburg, where she had a cousin. Her name was Elsa Lipschitz. And we went there, and we asked whether we could stay overnight, and they were happy to have us. But her husband wasn't there. The cousin's husband wasn't there. So this cousin had two daughters, one Ruth, who also died in a concentration camp. In fact, the city where they lived renamed the Adolf Hitler Platz Ruth Lipschitz Platz. Well, it doesn't impress me very much, but that's what it is. We have a picture of that. And there was another daughter, a younger daughter, Jutta, now Judith, who lives in Denver, Colorado. The husband wasn't there. So we asked, where's your husband? He is walking around in the forest, not to be found by the Gestapo. because the same thing had happened there. So we stayed until the early next morning. We went off to Hamburg. Now this cousin, Jutta then, Judith now, went via eventually 1941, her father had gone to Shanghai. Jews could go to Shanghai if they had a little American help. And the father had gone there, and the daughter Ruth had married, stayed in Germany, and perished in the camps. But Judith, I can't call her Jutta because I only know her as Judith, and her mother had gone via the Trans-Siberian Railroad in 1941 to Shanghai to join the father, where they stayed during the war. After the war, the parents went to America. Judith couldn't come to America. She had married a man from Vienna, and they wanted to go to Israel. They went to Israel for a while. In fact, their oldest daughter was a Sabra. She was born there. Doesn't speak Ivrit. As a baby, she was taken to Vienna. They had to go back to Vienna to settle some family affairs. And then they came to this country, and they're now living in Denver, Colorado. In fact, she made it her life work to tell school children about the Holocaust. And she got some sort of commendation or certificate from the DAR, Daughters of American Revolution. And she also had made a tape, and she goes around different schools. I mean, this is what she does. It's her in memory of what had happened. We see them quite often. So back to Schöneberg, we went to Hamburg, and Hamburg was different. In Germany, everybody used the greeting of Heil Hitler. We didn't, but all the Germans did. We came to Hamburg, and I had never been to Hamburg. My mother had been, and we didn't know to find my uncle's house, so we had to stop. And we asked the man, and the first thing he said, he didn't say Heil Hitler. He said, Guten Morgen, good morning. This made us really happy. I mean, it came as a shock, because we expected him to raise his arm and say Heil Hitler, and he said Guten Morgen. Nobody used that anymore. That was the old German greeting. We felt real good. He made us feel much better. We went to my uncle, Uncle Martin, my father's brother, who was a physician, and he walked around with a razor in his pocket and the dog on a leash. And he said, I'm not going with them, and they come for me, and if I tell the dog to bite them. That would help a lot. And or to attack them. But he said, if they get me, I at least want to have the comfort that I can shave. So he had soap and a razor in his pocket, and he was there. And there was also a son. At that time, his name was Kurt. He came to England, changed his name. A younger son. He was considered about 4 years younger than I was, or more than that. And Aunt Ruth, his wife. And I said to them, I asked them whether they had any friends, Gentile friends, in the villages around Hamburg, because I felt that might be a safer place to stay. Now we again didn't know it could still come to Hamburg too. It had happened in Hamburg, but they didn't live in a Jewish neighborhood. It happened in the Jewish neighborhoods where they took the men away. I think the neighborhood was called Grindel. I don't even know how to spell it. They didn't live there. So my uncle said, yes, I have lots of friends. I said, are there any that you can trust and that also would let us stay with them? He says, yeah, sure. So I had a car. He didn't have a car anymore. And we went in my car to this village. He directed me. He, Kurt, my cousin Kurt, and myself. And we stayed to these people. They knew what had happened. And they were very, very nice people, welcomed us wholeheartedly, offered us their best bedroom.
Now, was your mother still with you?
No, my mother stayed in Hamburg.
She did stay?
Yeah, stayed in Hamburg with my aunt, because they didn't take women. Women were not in danger at that time. So we prepared to stay there, but I found out that these friends of my uncle's were violent anti-Nazis, and they were actually an anti-Nazi cell. And it made me even more afraid. Now we were not only Jews, but and one of the women's father had just been arrested by the Nazis as a traitor, and they had a case against him. They could prove, and there was a death penalty on that. So I said to my uncle, it's very nice of these people. I wish there would be a lot of them. And if there had been a lot of them, Hitler could have probably been disposed of a long time ago, particularly if they would have gotten foreign help. But the world didn't help them, not even the Gentile anti-Nazis. So if the world would have helped them, there would have been probably no Second World War and certainly no Holocaust. And a lot of people would be alive today that are not anymore, not just Jews, also other people who died in the war. Anyway, my uncle, I had the car, so he had to do what I wanted to do. And he said, okay, we'll go home. And we said our goodbyes and thanked the people, and we went back in the car and went back to his house. In the meantime, my mother had left by train to go back to my hometown. And I stayed there for a few more days with him. Nothing happened anymore. And I went to the railroad station every day to buy the London Times, because we wanted to see what... And then I found out that actually the Gestapo was arresting people at the railroad stations, because some people tried to get out of Hamburg. But fortunately, it never caught me. And I didn't have any problem. But I did buy every morning. The London Times that went to Germany was not was the same London Times, but they had sections taken out. Anything that was was anti-German, they took out of the section that was distributed in Germany. I had read or subscribed to a foreign paper for a long time. It was a little Swiss paper that nobody knew of, and it had escaped the Nazis' supervision or censorship. It was called the Thurgauer Zeitung, and was published in a little town in Switzerland. And that's where I got my daily news from. No, weekly news. It was a weekly publication. It was a very small paper, so small that the Nazis didn't know of, but it was sent to me in the mail. So anyway, I was from Hamburg. I went to Berlin. Berlin was also a big town where I felt that I would be safer if something still happened. And my sister Leni, who was with my mother, had gotten married to my brother-in-law, who was an ex-district attorney. He was also an employee in my mother's business, because he didn't have a job anymore, just like my sister Erna, who was a physician. The company was top heavy with academics who had to be executives in the family business. They didn't contribute too much to it. My mother contributed more to them than vice versa, but this is the way it was. Anyway, my sister Leni had married Rudolf, my brother-in-law. Now, he had been in the concentration camp in 1933, because the whole district attorney's office in Chemnitz, where he was Jewish, most of them. And the Nazis just came in there and took him. But they didn't find him, because he wasn't in the office, but they found him later. And he'd spent a short time, maybe a month or two, in a concentration camp. In fact, we visited him there. He was not my brother-in-law then, but my parents knew him, because the religious instructions in our town were in our house. We had the biggest house. And all the students from the local school or surrounding schools came to our house, and a cantor came from Leipzig once a week, and he taught them. So that's where my parents knew him from. Anyway, he was in this concentration camp in 1933, and his father asked my father whether he would drive him there so he could visit his son. My father said yes. My father drove, not the chauffeur. I helped him. I had to go with him. And we were actually visiting in that concentration camp. But they were not the concentration camps that they became later on. Hitler had not come to power exactly under his own steam. They didn't have enough votes. The Nazis didn't have enough votes. So the royalists combined with them. And there was an organization called Stahlhelm, translates into steel helmet. They were old monarchists. And I think the second in command of this was half Jewish. Well, he was soon gotten rid of when they came to power, when the Nazis came. But they helped the Nazis actually to come to power. because everybody was against the communists at that time, and this is how they combined. But the Nazis disposed of these people. The camp commandant in this first concentration camp was one of these people. And he made a speech to the prisoners when they arrived. Now, these were there were very few Jewish prisoners. Most of them were communists, social democrats, anybody that was against the Nazis. And my brother-in-law was Jewish and an ex-district attorney. So the commandant made a speech that it was very friendly towards the prisoners. He said, "We won. This happened to you. If you would have won, you would be in my place, I would be in your place. As long as you don't give me any trouble, I am not going to give you any trouble." And actually, Sunday was visiting time. Everybody could go in there. It was like a picnic. They were all sitting outside. They were surrounded by guards, but we could go in there. We weren't searched or anything. And we could sit outside, and they sang songs and all that. But eventually, the camp commandant was shot by the Nazis. So this is how it ended. My brother-in-law got out of this camp and eventually ended up in our business. But after they got married, they wanted to go out on their own. And they started to live in Berlin. And everybody started to prepare for immigration. It was still, were in Berlin before 1938. And my brother-in-law, everybody learned the trade that he could possibly use, because he couldn't be a district attorney in any other country. So he learned how to make confectionery. I ate most of it. I got eventually. And he had been, while he was a student, in charge of a student cafeteria, which was, it's nothing to do with our Mensa, but it was called Mensa. Here, Mensa has a different meaning. He had been buying the meat and things like that. So he thought he would also be good for the restaurant business. So this was the year of the Olympic Games in Berlin. And either 36 or 37, I forgot. And the Nazis relaxed the anti-Jewish terror a little bit because they expected a lot of foreigners to come. So my brother-in-law opened a restaurant in Berlin, which did very well in the beginning, but he couldn't cook and neither could my sister. And it was after a short time, it was a financial, after the Olympic Games, everybody did business during the Olympic Games, but after that was over, it was a financial fiasco. And he opened it with my sister's money. So anyway, after that came the confectionery episode and intensive English learning. And my sister spoke fluent English. My brother-in-law didn't. He did speak high school English because it was the first language in high school, English and French. French second. So he pursued immigration. He had an uncle. He was lucky enough. He was half Jewish, but he was raised as a Jew. His mother was not Jewish. His father was Jewish. And his mother had a brother in Australia. This was a saving. The brother was willing, he lived there all his life. He was willing to give them a permit to enter Australia, which they pursued. But it took some time. So I went, when I came to Berlin from Hamburg, I'm backtracking a little bit now, I went to see an uncle of mine, my father's oldest brother, whose name was Max. He was a chemist, and he'd owned a pharmacy that they had taken away from him in Chemnitz. And he moved to Berlin to retire, but he was very comfortably off. He didn't need that pharmacy. In fact, in the end, he hadn't worked in it too much. He had a brother-in-law who was also a chemist who was in charge of the pharmacy. And they moved to Berlin, and they moved to a street that was called Kaiserallee. It was a very affluent part of Berlin where a lot of foreign diplomats lived. Most of the cars parked in the street, they had foreign diplomatic license plates. And I thought that might be a safe area. So I went to his house, and it was one of those things where you had a supervisor in the house, in the building. It was many apartments. And you pressed the doorbell, and it would ring upstairs, and then they could open the door from downstairs, which was, you have it here now a lot, but at that time it was something quite luxurious in Germany. They had I don't think they had a camera, but they had a mirror that they could see who was downstairs. And as I pressed the doorbell, my uncle had been for a walk, and he showed up behind me. And when he saw me, he had tears in his eyes. He had heard from a friend of his who was a doctor in Berlin, who had a son at the same college I was, what had happened there. And his son was one of the people who had been arrested. And he was so surprised to see me and so pleased to see me, he started to cry. And he invited me to come and stay with them. They had a very lovely apartment. And I had nowhere else to go, so that was the perfect solution. And I stayed with them. And under the circumstances, we had a very enjoyable time. We drove into the country, we went for walks, and the only thing that happened while I was there, and I visited my sister, but my sister had a small apartment, and I visited her almost every day, and my brother-in-law. But while I was there, the Germans had made a law that Jews were not allowed to have driver's licenses anymore. Now, I had a car parked in the street, but I had to hand in my license. And many of these laws that the Nazis made had very stiff sentences. Unlimited time in concentration camps, death penalties. These were the sentences that they had prepared for Jews. So I had to hand in my driver's license, and he didn't dare to drive without it because they had road stops, and I had to sell the car in the street. I found a buyer who paid me. He knew I was under pressure. I didn't tell him that, and he couldn't see it on my license plate. But he knew I was in a hurry to sell this car, and I needed cash. So he paid me. The car was 6 months old. I suffered a financial loss, but I had cash that the Nazis didn't know about, because my bank account had been blocked, and I was only given from my own money a very small monthly allowance for living expenses. That had happened to my mother also, and my other sister. And that was the customary thing. If you had over a certain amount of assets, they were all blocked. And anyway, then I had no more car. I now had to use the train and the streetcar and so on and so forth.
What were you doing at the time?
Nothing.
You couldn't be in school?
No,
or?
Nothing. You prepared. See what happened. I should say that as soon as the events happened on the 9th of November, 1938, my cousin Walt in Edinburgh started to get us out. And Britain allowed people to come in who wanted to work as maids in the household, which they were short of, and a lot of Jewish women took that job. They allowed people to take trainee jobs where they were paid 25 shillings, no more. And they allowed students, high school students, if there was some family that would take them. And then they allowed children's transports, like Sonia came on, my wife. But they also had to be guaranteed for by some English families. Well, my cousin Walter had been in Edinburgh since 1933, he knew a lot of people. He was at the university. He was working at the university. And he went to lots of Jewish people to ask them for help. Not financial help, it wasn't money that much that was necessary, but he found me a trainee job in a junkyard, in a wrecking yard. Now this man wasn't Jewish, but one of his friends was Jewish, and through this friend, this man was a Catholic. His name was Harris, and his friend's name was also Harris. That wasn't his real name because he was a Russian Jew, and the Russian Jews didn't have the name Harris. He had changed it because it sounded better in England. He was a tailor. He had a tailoring shop. Anyway, I found this. My cousin Walter found this job for me in this junkyard. He also found a Scottish family that for 20 shillings would give me board and lodgings. Now I earned 25. And it was quite a distance away, but it was in a nice home and a very nice area of Edinburgh, up on a hill. And I paid them 20 shillings a week. And he had found for my sister a job as a midwife. She wasn't allowed to practice as a doctor, but he found her a job as a midwife in an Edinburgh hospital. And he found a Jewish family who would accept my cousin Kurt from Hamburg in their home and allow him to go and finish his high school in Edinburgh. And this is what happened. Then he found possibilities to come to England, or got visas for 18 other people. One of them was his mother. This was not such a problem, because the mother had a sister in Watsonville, California, who financially supported her. His mother's cousin, his piano teacher from Hamburg, who worked as a housemaid, and several others. Altogether 18. This was a tremendous job, and I'll never forget Walter for saving my life. And anyway, we lived in Edinburgh. I worked in the junkyard.
How did all this transpire? Did you take a train or a bus?
No.
How did you actually physically get out of Germany?
Well, there was a difficulty, because you needed an exit permit, and that had to be approved by the Gestapo, and also by the customs, and by the Internal Revenue, that didn't owe taxes. Before you could leave, my bank account was blocked. I could only take out a few marks each month. But you could get special permission for special purposes. Now, immigration was such a special purpose, and I applied for money to pay for my airplane ticket. You know, I had money, so it wasn't any good to me after I left. So I figured, whatever they allow me to do, I'll do. So I bought an airplane ticket from Berlin via Hamburg to London, and from London to Edinburgh. And I left Germany on a Ju-52, which later on it was Lufthansa, which later on became a bomber, which was the equivalent to the 747s, but in miniature form, but it was their biggest plane.
And what date was that?
That was on the 20th of April, 1939. But before that, I had to go through all this rigmarole to pay it was called Reichsfluchtsteuer. It was a tax that was put on the people who left Germany. My luggage was first investigated. Every book that I took was gone through by the Gestapo, that I wasn't hiding anything in there, or taking books which they didn't permit to be had. Then it was gone through by the customs. For everything I took that was new, I had to pay again. I had to pay a purchase price, then I had to pay the same amount to the government to be allowed to take it out. Now, most of the things were new, because, you didn't want to take old things with you.
Now, had you met Sonia at this time?
I had met Sonia in Cottbus, and I'm always going back and forth. I hope that doesn't disturb too much.
Yeah.
Well, I had met Sonia in Cottbus. She was a good-looking girl, and she was Jewish. So she became my girlfriend. And when I ran away from Cottbus, I had her picture on my desk. And when the Gestapo couldn't find me and they saw this picture, they searched my room, they called her. But she didn't know where I was. I hadn't told her. In fact, she didn't know I'd left. Every Jewish man in Cottbus was arrested and taken to concentration camp, but Sonia's father and I. They couldn't find me, and they'd forgotten Sonia's father. Now, Sonia's father was stateless. He had come from what was at that time Russia when he was born to Germany before the First World War, and he had never. They were given the option after the First World War to opt for Soviet citizenship or Polish citizenship, because that part of Russia had become Poland. He opted for neither, because I don't think he was too intrigued with being a citizen of either one of those countries. So he remained stateless, and they had genuine stateless passports. But the stateless Jews were persecuted just as much as the German Jews, not the foreign Jews. In the beginning, in fact, they didn't persecute the Polish Jews, because Germany was very friendly with Poland for a while. In fact, the Marshal Goering went hunting in Poland. He was invited by the Polish president. But that changed.
I think we're at a point now where we want to finish the end of this tape,
Yeah.
and we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back and
Okay.
continue the story.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is it that long already?
This is the continuation of the testimony of Henry Tebrich. And Henry, you were telling us about your leaving Germany.
I want to go back once more to the day I left Germany. It was the 20th of April, 1939, and the 20th of April happens to be Hitler's birthday. There was a large German Air Force parade in the sky, which was not exactly for me, although they were glad I left, but it was for the Führer's birthday. My mother, my sister Erna, my sister Leni, my brother-in-law Rudolf, and one of the most important persons apart from my mother was my future wife Sonja, and a lot of other relatives came to Tempelhof Airport with me. That was the Berlin airport, and I boarded the plane for London. There was a stop in Hamburg, and in Hamburg I went through customs and also was examined again by the Gestapo. And the Gestapo officer, when he saw my passport with a J in it, said, "Of course you realize that you cannot come back, but then who wanted to?" That's my answer to that. I didn't tell him that because you kept very quiet at those times. I boarded the plane, I arrived in London. It was not a very long flight. And at the airport expecting me was a cousin of my father's with his wife and another distant relative. This cousin of my father's had been a dental surgeon in Chemnitz in Germany, and he was one of 50 dental surgeons who were allowed into England without any further examination, and they were allowed to practice as long as they didn't practice in London. They were screened very thoroughly, and apparently he must have been a very good dental surgeon to qualify for that. He settled as close to London as he could on one of the suburbs, which he was allowed to do, and I went to his house for a short stay, and they showed me around London, and they welcomed me, and they were very nice to me. And after that, they took me back to the airport. At that time, the London airport was not Heathrow that it is now, it was Croydon. They took me back to Croydon, and I boarded a plane, which was a miniature plane compared with the Ju-52 that I'd come on. It was a British plane, which took me to Edinburgh. It's going to take me to Edinburgh. However, while we were in the air, the Edinburgh airport had been taken over by the Royal Air Force because I guess they were afraid war would come, and this was at the end of April. So the Air Force had taken over the civilian airport in Edinburgh, and we had to land in a field about 30 miles from east of Edinburgh. I didn't know Edinburgh. Although I spoke English, Scottish was a different language, and I was a little bit worried, and my cousin Walter, who lived in Edinburgh, was going to meet me at the airport in Edinburgh. Well, I was worried, would he know that I didn't arrive in Edinburgh? Well, they had notified him, and he had come out to this airport that was near Grangemouth. Had a different name, but it wasn't an airport. It was a field. There was one wooden shed there, but they did have a fire engine that met every plane. Fire engine came out. When my cousin saw the fire engine, he was very worried. And also they told him there was only one female passenger on board. There was only one passenger on board, but the passenger wasn't female, it was me. So anyway, I met Walter, and they gave us a limousine and drove us to the next town where there was a railroad station, and we had high tea there, and then we went to Edinburgh, and he introduced me to the Scottish family, and then a couple of days later I went to work in the junkyard. I was there, and then my mother sent me regular packages. She could still do that because I had very little money, and she knew I liked chocolate, and she'd always sent Swiss chocolate, and in fact, one of the family that I stayed with during that summer of 1939, just before the outbreak of war, visited my mother in Germany. She was a teacher, and she spoke fluent German, and her sister was employed by a minister in the Lithuanian government. And she met her sister in Germany. Her sister was not Lithuanian, but I don't know how this came about. In fact, later on they said that she was a British spy, but I'm not sure. So anyway, she visited her sister in Germany, and at the same time she visited my mother, and she also visited my cousin Kurt's parents in Hamburg. And she came back, and then war broke out. First, the Germans marched into Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Britain declared war on September 3rd, 1939. And we were asked to come, not asked, ordered to come to a tribunal that would make sure that we were friendly aliens. There were three categories, A, B, and C. A was immediate internment, which usually covered the real Germans who lived in England. There were quite a few of them. Some of them lived there for quite some time. One of Hitler's closest friends lived there, who was not a friend of Hitler's anymore. His name was Hanfstaengl. And he was interned immediately, even though he was a Nazi, but he was not the Hitler Nazi. And there were a lot of others. They were interned under category A. Then there were B. B people were restricted to, I think, a 5-mile limit from which they couldn't move. And they had other restrictions. Now, in Edinburgh, most of our refugees, they were attested being refugees by the local rabbi and by the police chief and so on and so forth. We were documented. And most of us were C, and it carried another addition to that in our aliens registration books, which would be the green card here. It said Class C, alien, refugee from Nazi oppression. That was right in this registration book. It was a grey booklet with a picture in it. No restrictions, apart from the usual restrictions that people had. At that time you had to have an identity card and so on and so forth, which the British never had before, but that had to do with the war. Everybody had that. So no restrictions. So we went along, did our jobs and businesses as before. Then came Dunkirk. And the British, or the Allies, were beaten by the Nazis. Belgium was occupied, Holland was occupied, and part of France was occupied. And it was a miracle. They saved most of their men. Every little ship crossed the channel to bring men back from the continent. They saved everybody in those little ships. I mean, most of the men, but they had to leave all their equipment behind. The Nazis now were very, very strong, and the British expected an invasion any moment. And that invasion would probably have succeeded. The Germans had already appointed area chiefs for different parts of England. They had some friends in England. There was a group of people in England who were friendly towards the Nazis because they thought the Nazis would be a bulwark against communism. And these people would have been involved in this. The Nazis would have trusted them. But that wasn't the majority. The majority of people were good people. So the British they lost, and Chamberlain was kicked out, and Churchill became Prime Minister. Churchill had been all along against the Nazis, but nobody took any notice of him. But they lost their head, and they interned all the aliens, regardless of status, in the protected areas. Protected areas were areas where there were ports or near the coast, any invasion-prone areas, and that included Edinburgh. So Edinburgh was a port, good-sized port. So one day, a policeman came and asked me to come along. He was very friendly, and he said I could take a suitcase and I would be back pretty soon. So he took me to the police station where my cousin Walter was already there, and Kurt arrived a little time later. Now Kurt shouldn't have been there at all because he was under 16. but they got him by accident. So we were there, and the whole Jewish refugee club was there, the men, and they gave us a meal, and they were very friendly. And later on that day, they took us to a school that had been converted to an internment camp in Edinburgh. That school was already occupied by real Nazi war prisoners. Some sailors that had been on ships when war broke out and were arrested right away as enemy aliens, and some prisoners of war that the British had taken on the continent while the going was good. And actually our status changed. While we were under the Home Office before, which was a civilian, which is like our Interior Ministry Secretary of the Interior here, we now came under the War Department. And to the War Department, prisoners were prisoners. They didn't care whether they were Nazis, Jews, non-Jews, anti-communists, communists. They were prisoners, and they had to be treated as such. And the place was not meant to have large. It was an internment camp, temporary, for temporary use. I mean, they would transfer people there from there to regular places. It was just like a holding unit. We were guarded by British soldiers with bayonets and rifles and the whole business. And the sanitary facilities were terrible. The camp was not expecting large crowds. Now, a lot of these people in Edinburgh were professional people, university professors and the older ones, and the younger ones were in jobs like I was in, or at high school like my cousin Kurt. But I think most of them were academics. With us was one academic, and his name was Klaus Fuchs. Now, Klaus Fuchs was at that time not very well known. He only became known when he became the atom spy, and that was much later. But Klaus Fuchs was a brilliant scientist at Edinburgh University who the British needed very, very badly. But he was interned. Anyway, and there was another one. There were quite a few famous people with us. We were in this camp, didn't get along with the Germans, didn't have enough toilets, didn't have any bathrooms, no showers, wash basins. Toilets soon were plugged up, the wash basins were plugged up. It was terrible. So one day, by that time the British decided that we didn't get along too well with the German Nazi prisoners. They were on another floor, but in the same camp. And they decided to transfer us, and we were loaded on a train. We were not told where we would go. We were never told where you'd go. The train windows had barbed wire, and it was guarded by soldiers. So was the station when we left. And the train went south. And we went to a place called Huyton, near Liverpool, which had been a area where they built houses for low earning people. They would sell them the houses, and the amount that they had to pay was the same as rent. But it was brand new, and they were all empty. There was nothing in them. They sent us there, and they put barbed wire around it, but on guards again. And we had to fill straw sacks with straw and slept on the straw sacks. So many people to a room. And we stayed there for a while, and we thought that would be our place to stay until we could get a release. We always hoped that sooner or later they would find out who we really were.
Were you very uncomfortable in that situation?
It wasn't very comfortable to sleep on these things, but we started a camp university, we had a camp orchestra, we had a camp drama group, and they put on a mock trial. We had a bunch of Cambridge students with us, and they started this camp university, and we had a very large establishment of professors. So they carried on as they would have done, only they didn't get paid for it this time. And the older people were worried because there were no breadwinners left for their families.
Did you have food? How did they...
Yeah, we got the same as... The food amount was set by the Geneva Convention. Every soldier every engineer, I think, had to be fed the same thing as their soldiers or something. I don't know, there was some regulation to them. They stuck to that. And we were asked whether we wanted to notify the Red Cross. Now, the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, was the representative of the Nazi government. And in Germany, the Red Cross was the representative of the British government. And we didn't want to be represented by anything that had anything to do with the Nazi German government. So we refused that. We didn't. But to communicate with relatives in Germany, my mother was still outside, she was not in a camp then, was impossible, because you had to use prisoner of war mail, which was Red Cross mail. So we refused that. I couldn't tell my, and I had been in contact with my mother via America, where we had relatives in Richmond, Virginia, and she'd been writing to me via them, and we used sort of code names and things, but I couldn't do that anymore. So my mother didn't know where I was. So anyway, we were in this camp in Huyton, and that lasted for a while, until one day they took us out of the camp and they marched us into a port and put us on a small boat. And that boat took us to the Isle of Man. Now the Isle of Man was a seaside place, one town, Douglas, and there was other smaller places, full of hotels, because the British had gone there on vacation. But during the war, there were no vacationists. So the hotels became available, and the Isle of Man had been an internment camp for the Germans in the First World War, and somebody in the war office remembered that. So they sent us to the Isle of Man, and we were there in a hotel, but it wasn't operated like a hotel. I was in Douglas Central Camp. It was surrounded by barbed wire and guards again, and we were inside, and the Russians were dumped, and then we had to find somebody to cook them. So I was there, and the internees started a post office. I don't know why we had a post office, because we didn't have any mail. But I became the assistant postmaster. But it was nice because I had an office, I could get away from the crowds, and there was some little mail, but it certainly didn't need two people, a postmaster, an assistant postmaster, and a clerk, 3 people. But it was nice. Oh, I know why I got the job, because I had a portable typewriter. And they were making all sorts of lists, and for the universities and so on and so forth. I can't type, only like this, with 2 fingers. But that's the reason. And a friend of mine had become postmaster. So he selected me, and he put it over that I became assistant postmaster. Anyway, I was sitting in that office, and then the British were still afraid of this invasion. So they had made arrangements. They had approached the Dominion government in Canada and also Australia to take German prisoners of war. Now, I make a difference between a prisoner of war and the military people or a civilian internee. Now, we consider ourselves anything as civilian internees. The Canadian government and the Australian government had agreed to take a fixed amount, they said, I don't remember what it was, of prisoners of war, because prisoners of war are governed by their own officers. The camp commandant tells their senior officer what they have to do, and he sees that they do it. When you have a bunch of Jewish refugees, there isn't such a thing. Everybody runs in every direction. We did have a camp government that was elected, but it has no power to enforce their regulations. So, and we had, as I said, a lot of academics. We had a yeshiva, and we had. Oh, we also had a Catholic seminary. They were not Nazis. They were young Catholic students who were at the seminary in Scotland, and the whole thing was taken. So they were there too. So the British government had approached the Canadians to take these prisoners of war, but they didn't have enough. They set on a certain figure, but they didn't have enough prisoners of war. So they put the refugees with the prisoners of war. What was easier than that? They knew that the refugees wouldn't complain to the Geneva Convention or to the Red Cross. So they put us in. We didn't know where we were going. We were taken off the Isle of Man. If I would have asked, I would have refused, because I intended to stay in England. And so did my cousin Walter. My cousin Walter was almost British, because he'd been there since 1933. His naturalization was far advanced. And he was taken also. And Kurt had been separated from us because he was a youngster, and they told him they would send him somewhere to a camp where there was a high school, which wasn't true. He ended up in Canada on a much worse ship than I did. And so one day they put us back on this little ferry boat to the port of Liverpool, and there was a big ship standing there. And we were put on that big ship. The top cabins, the luxury cabins, were occupied by German officers, prisoners of war. The next deck was two decks were occupied by German soldiers, and the Jewish refugees were on the bottom. And terrible sanitary conditions. I mean, it was unbelievable. And we had an intelligence officer with us who spoke German, and his famous words when we complained about something was always, "Don't you realize there's a war on?" which was famous in England. Anyway, we were on this ship. While we were on the ship, and I don't know how we heard this, we had heard that the first ship had been sunk by German U-boats. The first ship of prisoners of war and internees. And that was the Arandora Star. Had been that was in 40. And in 40, the Germans had two bucket battleships in the North Atlantic, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, and they also had a lot of U-boats, and they were very successful in sinking Allied shipping. So this first ship had been sunk. Some people were saved. They took them back to England, and finally they sent them to Australia. I mean, the refugees. But I think Australia only had one shipload of people. And some of them ended up in Israel later on from Australia. So then we were on this ship called Tebrich, which was very fast. We didn't have a convoy. We zigzagged all the way to Quebec, and we got there. On arrival in Quebec, we were taken off the ship, and the Canadians had been told we were prisoners of war, and the Canadian soldiers robbed us. They stole everything that they could lay their hands on. Now, they were a special category. They were not the normal type of Canadian soldier. I think they were all old veterans. And maybe not of the best. Maybe they were people who they wouldn't put in other units. Anyway, they robbed us, and later on they were court-martialed. So we had arrived in Quebec, and we were put on buses and taken up to Quebec Citadel, which is above Quebec. And they had a camp for us there. But there were German prisoners of war in that camp. Now, the German prisoners of war that came with us went somewhere else. We were just refugees and anti-Nazis, mostly Jewish refugees, and the yeshiva and also the Catholic seminarians. And we marched into this camp. They took us in buses. And the only good point in this camp was that the food was terrific, because the Canadians had lots to eat. In England, everything was rationed. We had white bread, real white bread, as much as we wanted to eat. There was no shortage of food there. And the sanitary conditions were fairly good. When we were in this camp, we had a good view. We could see all the ships coming into port, because it was high up on a hill. And also next door to us was the Governor General's mansion, who was a British, it was the Earl of Athlone at that time, his summer mansion. And he lived there in the summer with his Princess Alice. And they were close relatives of the British King, King George at that time. With us was a man who was a very fine man. He was a real German, and he went under the name of Count Lingen. But that wasn't his real name. That was one of his titles. His real title was Prince Friedrich Wilhelm von Preußen. And he was a Hohenzollern, and the Hohenzollern was the German dynasty. He was the grandson of the Kaiser, of the ex-Kaiser and the son of the Crown Prince, who had been in the German army, like a lot of nobility were, but he disliked service under Hitler, and he went to Cambridge and studied agriculture. There he fell in love with Lady Diane Guinness of the famous brewery people, and he became engaged to her, and I think later on he married her. I don't remember that. And he studied agriculture, and he was one of our internees. And our camp, that consisted of probably 80 or 85% Jews, elected him to be camp leader, to represent us against the Communists. I think we thought that he would probably have most authority, since and his aunt lived next door in the governor's mansion, Princess Alice. But he didn't. He refused. They offered him once that he would be left out of the camp on parole, but he refused. He wanted to stay with us. So that was one. Then we had, of course, Klaus Fuchs was the other famous man. Then we had a lot of people who had written music for movies and all sorts of people. we had an Austrian baron who it was crazy. He had written the book I and Metternich. I don't know, Metternich was a famous Austrian chancellor who was very devious, but it would have been normally, but it should have been Metternich and I, but he said I and Metternich because he was an Austrian baron. And he always hung on to Count Lingen because he was also a blue-blooded man, but Count Lingen got rid of him and he didn't like him. Lingen had his office, I was again the assistant postmaster, and Lingen had his office as the camp, called himself a camp supervisor, next door to my office, and I met him many times. He was a very, very fine man. And
How long were you in this camp?
Less than 6 months. I'll tell you what happened. So we were very unhappy in this camp. The Canadians were very unhappy because they didn't know who we were. The British had told him, and this is not a story, this is true, to come for our civilian clothing, because we were all dressed in civilian clothing, and prisoners of war wore uniforms, that we had jumped, parachuted over Rotterdam, as to jump behind the the Allied lines. That was their reason. That was the reason for our civilian clothing. The Germans had used parachutists in civilian clothing to cause havoc behind Allied lines, but we weren't those people. And certainly the yeshiva was easily recognized because they had side locks, and some of them wore kaftans, silk coats. So, and the Catholics was also a different story. We were in the province of Quebec, which was a Catholic province, and the cardinal in Quebec sort of found out about the Catholic seminarians, and there was a famous shrine there called Saint Anne of Beaupré. So somehow the cardinal managed to take the seminarians to this holy shrine, but we didn't have a holy shrine, neither had the yeshiva. We stayed there, but he took them there for a visit. And the French Canadians were not too friendly towards the Jews at that time. But we were not in contact with them, but they went on walks on Sundays, and they could see inside the camp. We were behind the barbed wire, and they were outside the barbed wire, but they could look inside parts of the camps. So we put a huge banner on there. We had artists with us too, that in French, that we were nous sommes réfugiés de oppression, Nazism. We put that on there, and they saw that, and they couldn't understand that. It was their language, but we were supposed to be in a prisoner of war camp. So the camp commandant was a nice guy. He was a colonel, and he had been a coal merchant in civilian life. And he was real nice. Unfortunately, he was court-martialed because he was held responsible. He had nothing to do with this robbery, but he was court-martialed and he lost his job because ultimately he was responsible for all the soldiers. But he was a nice guy, and we had shows, we had exhibitions, we had painters, we had artists, we had all sorts of things. And we again had a camp university with the Cambridge students and so on and so forth. But we couldn't get out. And we wanted to do something to help defeat Hitler. I had volunteered for the army before I was interned, but they wouldn't take any aliens. So the British government sent in another intelligence officer who had been connected with the Home Office, and he knew our condition, Captain Paris. And he tried to straighten this out with the Canadians, but the head of the internment operations in Canada never forgave Britain of what they had pulled on them. And one day this officer went to see this camp. He was the supervisor of all the camps, and he made him kill his heels for 2 hours outside his office while he was dictating a private letter to the secretary, and the men could hear this. It wasn't the very best relation. He couldn't achieve too much. The only thing he achieved, that they would send us to another camp, which we were told would be supervised internment, but not this military kind of thing, and we would be allowed to work for the war effort in some camp industries, make gloves and shirts and things like that. And we were taken under guard to a camp in New England, Sherbrooke, which was on the American border, near Montreal. We came there. It was a locomotive repair shed with pits so that they could work from underneath, and railroad tracks, no toilets, or very few, And the railroad engine had been taken out, was empty, it was dirty, it was very cold, there were 3 to 4 foot icicles hanging out from the roof outside, and it was totally catastrophe. We went on a hunger strike because of that. In the meantime, in England, members of Parliament had asked the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary what was going on. They weren't told, because this was now a military operation, it was secret, the War Office was in charge. So some of our internees were friends of some of the members of Parliament. And there was a lady member of Parliament, she asked a lot of questions, I forgot her name. And the British government was forced to do something. So they sent us a very high government official, his name was Patterson, who was an extremely nice man. And he was supposed to do something. We had also B aliens. We didn't have any A aliens, but we had B aliens. This wasn't always fair to make him category B. One guy became category E and he had lost a leg in a concentration camp. And the judge thought it was safer to make everybody B, because then he didn't have that much responsibility if something went wrong, if he missed somebody. That wasn't one area of England. But this man, this Patterson, Mr. Patterson came and he established an office in all the camps, a little cubicle. The Canadians didn't treat him too well either. But he tried to work out something with America, because some of our internees were only in England on a temporary base. They were on the way to America, but the coroner number hadn't been called. They had papers, but it wasn't that time to go. And he thought that America would let them cross. But America had a regulation. It all sounds so stupid and ridiculous that if you came to America, you had to be a fare-paying passenger on a ship that was registered. Well, we didn't pay our fare to be taken to internment camps in Canada, and the ships that we came on were troop transports that had been converted to internment ships. So America enforced that law. And at one time they told this Mr. Patterson, he went to New York to talk to people in the government, they said that they would let him come, and then they said they wouldn't let him come. They had to go back to England before they could come and be released. They could only come as free people. So this didn't work. So anyway, we were in this camp. The camp was terrible. The commanding officer of the camp commandant, was terrible. His standing words were, if you play balls with me, I play balls with you. So in the end we called him Major Balls. And he had a sergeant major who was his underling, also terrible. One of the guard lieutenants had been a fellow student in Cambridge with one of the internees, and they were on a first name basis. I mean, it was an unbelievable situation. My cousin Walter's naturalization had come through, but he couldn't be naturalized in Canada. He had to be naturalized in Britain. So, but there was no way at that time to go back. So Patterson interviewed everybody who wanted to go back to England, every C category alien. When it came to my turn, he said, I cannot apologize for my government. Governments never apologize. But as far as I am personally concerned, I am extremely sorry what happened to you, and you will be on the first ship back. We didn't know when. So finally, there were 260 or 70 people who were on that ship. Count Lingen was one of them too. And so was Klaus Fuchs, because they needed him in England to work on the atom bomb. So, I mean, it's unbelievable. In fact, they naturalized Fuchs, because had they not naturalized him, they couldn't dealt with him as a traitor later on, because as a German citizen he could do any espionage he wanted to. So they had to naturalize him to catch him later on. I don't know whether they knew he was a spy. I don't think he was a spy at that time, but he certainly was a communist. That we knew, because he tried to convert some of the youngsters in our camp to communism. He had one hut that he lived in, and it was he was trying to make a communist cell out of it. He learned that.
How did you finally get into the British military?
Well, see, we were put on this ship, and it was called Tisville, and it was a Belgian ship. We changed the name somewhat because it was a terrible ship. We've changed the last letter, and I don't want to tell you what we changed it to. But it was a Belgian ship that was a Belgian Congo steamer that carried bananas, and it was flat-bottomed. But it came from the Congo to Spain. In Spain, the Belgian crew ran away, including the captain, and they were left with the remaining crew of Asians and one Jewish, at that time, Palestinian baker. There was no Israel, it was still Palestine.
I think at this time we might want to start getting into the military experience.
Okay, all right. Now comes I came back to England. It took us 3 weeks to get back because we went on it should have taken 5 days. And I joined the army. The only army unit open was the Pioneer Corps. They had two kinds. They had the British Pioneer Corps, which was in the British Pioneer Corps you had leftovers that couldn't be used anywhere else. In the Alien Pioneer Corps, which was headed by a Jewish Lord Reading, who became the colonel, he had this idea, were young Jewish refugees. We didn't carry arms, we were supposed to dig trenches. The sergeants were British, and they carried arms. But you had to go into this, and that was the only unit open to us. Our people could become corporals, I think, and maybe later on, much later they could get commissions, but that was much later. At that time, corporals, I think, was as high as you could get. Anyway, I was in this unit, and I didn't like to dig trenches. And I didn't feel that was that much of a contribution to the war effort either. So I was still in the Pioneer Corps, but I could drive. So they attached me to the Royal Engineers, which was a road-building outfit, heavy equipment outfit, actually. And I was attached to them, and I drove a truck, or a lorry.
This was in England?
That was in England. And we had Italian prisoners of war who loaded up the truck, and I was sitting in the cabin, and I drove the stuff somewhere, and then they would use it to build a road with. But I wanted to get out of that. And they started a new unit, which was called Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, or for short REME. They had abbreviations for everything. And they needed people with technical ability, and I applied for that. Radar had come out, and they needed people to supervise the radar units and repair them and so on and so forth. I volunteered for that, and I was accepted. They looked at my enlistment papers and that said textile engineering student, and they forgot the textile, and I was an engineering student. So I got into REMEs. And I was in that for quite a while, and I ended up before you could get into this, you had to pass certain tests, and they would send you to a place near London, which was very nice because Sonia was living in London. We weren't married, but I could visit with her every night. I passed my test, and then I was transferred into this new unit. I was one of the first that got out of the Pioneer Corps. And I was stationed in the north of England, and I was put in charge of it, nothing to do with technicalities or technicians' work. I was put in charge of a fire detail. My job was to see that the fire engines were running with all the fire people. They were on fire. And that the men were there for the nightly fire detail. I had to check their names. And I got fed up with it. I was sitting there, but I did have a day pass. I could go to town every day, which was nice. But I didn't like it. It was boring. So I went to the office and I said, I don't like this. Don't you have something else? They found something else. The Sicilian campaign was starting. And they sent me to an embarkation camp where people were getting ready for the invasion of Sicily. And I was put into a small unit of technicians. Most of them were gun experts, heavy gun experts, naval gun experts, real heavy guns. They were supposed to check the heavy guns that were fired by artillery. Also, no gun could be fired unless we had inspected and certified it. And the first shot that was fired, I think, on a 25 or 40-foot lanyard in case the gun exploded. So we were far enough away, but our people had to fire the first shot. And I was made the vehicle inspector. I had to go around the artillery units to see that they did the maintenance properly on their vehicles, which was nice. I got a car, and I had freedom and mobility, and I traveled all over Italy. As the Allies advanced, I advanced with them. I ended up in Venice, ate my first donuts in an American canteen.
Yeah.
I never knew.
How did you get into the intelligence then?
From there, I got into intelligence.
Oh, tell us about that.
I'll tell you about that. So then, this was also a boring job, because they never fired the heavy guns. The Germans didn't have enough material anymore to attack, and I applied for I found the intelligence service needed people. So I applied for the intelligence, and I was asked to come to headquarters, and they call it vetted, V-E-T-T-E-D. I don't know whether you use that word here. Well, it was an interview. And they had my background in front of them, and they were very happy that I spoke a little French and German and English. And in the interview, it came out that I had a cousin in America, also from Germany, who was in the American G2. G2 was American intelligence. So they were very happy about that. They were very impressed. I don't know what he was doing, but he was in G2. He'd taken me, I met him in England again. So anyway, I was in the intelligence service, and I was sent to the south of England, a place called Castellamare, which is outside Naples, where we had a huge intelligence headquarters. And I got some training there, and I had to lead Mein Kampf, and I had to know all the Nazi details and so on and so forth. And then they sent me up to northern Italy, and I finally ended up in Austria, and that was the most interesting part of my army career. That was about 9 or 10 months. I was in charge of I was sent to Steiermark, which is an Austrian province. Steiermark was the province that was occupied by the British. The Americans had the nice part of Austria, which was Tyrol. The Russians had not so nice a part further north, and I was in Steiermark, which was all right. I was sent to a town. Our headquarters was in a town called Leibniz, and my commanding officers sent me to take over it would be called a county here, for intelligence work near the Yugoslav border, the Hungarian border, and to the north we had the Russian zone of occupation. Now we were supposed to know everything that was going on the other side of the border, but we were not allowed to go there. We were not allowed to cross the border, not into the Russian zone, not into the Yugoslav zone, and not into the other. But how
did you accomplish
we had a net of informants, which were over there, and which somehow we got in contact with. We had a cover name. My cover name was Grenzpolizei, which meant frontier police. But that's nothing to do with us. It was just something to show to the Austrians.
Now, you said somewhere along the line that you got to interview some German prisoners. Could you tell us about that?
Really, I had nothing to do with German prisoners, but they had one who had escaped. There was an infantry unit in this town, a British infantry unit, and they had picked up and escaped German prisoners who had escaped from a Yugoslav internment camp. And this guy, they didn't know what to do with him. So they brought him to me. They knew I spoke German. They didn't know that I was German. Nobody knew. The army people knew, but not the people there. And they brought him to my office, and they asked me, what do we do with him? Is he of any intelligence importance? I didn't think so, because he was just a regular soldier. But then somebody else higher up could have been hiding in a private's uniform, which happened. Anyway, I interrogated him. I found out that he came from a town where I had an aunt, step-sister of my mother's, and I knew that town real well. And I described the town to him in order to gain his confidence, and he couldn't understand that. He thought British intelligence must be unbelievably intelligent, that they knew the department stores in that town, the name of the streets, the whatever. But he had nothing to tell me. It was all useless. So he was taken to another prisoner of war camp in Austria and left there, and I forgot all about it. But I had another experience. Does the name Artukovic mean anything to you? He was the Yugoslav who was living in Surfside, who was sent finally back to Yugoslavia. Well, one day I was called back from my place on the Yugoslav border to my headquarters, and we were locked up. And my commanding officer, who was a good friend of mine, or became a good friend of mine, told us that we couldn't get out, but the next morning we were supposed to look for Artukovic, and there was another one. I forgot the other man's name, because they were hiding somewhere. But he also said, they're not hiding here, and we're not going to find them. But we have to go through the motion, because the Allies, the Yugoslavs were allies, the Russians were allies, want us to. Artukovic was on his way to America, but we didn't know that. I don't know how he came, but a lot of these people were helped along in Rome. And he was, I guess, a Roman Catholic, so he had been the Minister of Justice in the Croatian government. Now, the Croatians were German-friendly. They had a similar unit to the German SS, which was called Ustashi. And they had the same signs and so on and so forth. And I had caught several of them. Now, I was interested in the Ustashi, because they had lots to tell. Artukovic was never found, but we were sent the next morning after we'd been locked up to a displaced persons camp near there. The displaced persons camp had been surrounded by British troops, and we were supposed to look through this displaced persons camp to find Artukovic. But we didn't find him. We did find a German district leader, Nazi district leader, who was arrested in the displaced persons camp. But Artukovic was not there. He was on his way to Surfside, California.
Do you think this would be a good time to start looking at the pictures? Because you then went back to England after that.
Then after my army career, I was in the army for almost 5.5 years, went back to England. Before I left England, I got married to Sonia in 1943. And then I got back to England, and I got a job in a textile import-export agency. I had applied for a job at the Foreign Office, and that had a job available that was just like the one I did in the army. But they were going to send me to Germany. And Sonia said, we don't go there. And that's how we came to America.
Okay. Well, let's take a look at some of these pictures that you brought that will tell us another story, because
This is my great-grandfather, who was born in 1810 in Bumst, near Posen. And he is actually after the episode in England, is the first one then we can put our fingers on. He was, this is my grandfather, the son of my great-grandfather, and my grandmother. And they actually started the family business in Leisnig. I never met any of those because I was born much later than they had died. This is my mother's father, and the little boy there with the satchel on his back is me. And it's my grandmother who's under me. That is my grandfather and my grandmother, my mother's side, is Helfts, and I was the little boy up there. My father's brothers, and this is my father. This is my father and mother's engagement picture. My German birth certificate, I was born before they used this, but this birth certificate was made out later, and then they put the swastika underneath. And you can see my name is Heinz Sigmund. Which was legally changed when I joined the army. My three sisters, Irma, who became a physician, Ruth, who died in 1925 of polio, and Lainey, who immigrated to Australia. This is our family business, and you can see the name of Sigmund Tebrich on there. The picture was taken a long time ago. It looked old, different later. And this is my cousin Walter, who I owe my life to, and my sister Erna.
And Erna is the one who is the physician.
Erna is the one who is the physician who did not make it to England. She got to Venlo in Holland, and since the British visas had been recalled because of the beginning of the war, she was sent back to Germany and died with my mother in, I believe, Majdanek. That is the German death certificate that shows that my mother died or was murdered and sister were murdered in the extermination camp in Poland, which I received after the war. These were the death notices when my father died in Germany in 1934. That was the one my mother put in the paper. This was put in the paper by our employees from the business. And here you see the swastika. The Nazis were strong then already. This is my girlfriend Sanya, and this one also with my part of my car. The car saved my life. This is a card that my sister Erna sent to a cousin who was married to a Gentile in Germany, notifying her that this card was sent on Wednesday, that on Friday they would be sent to a place in Poland, a relocation place. They were not told it was an extermination camp. And she informed my cousin on Wednesday that Friday they would send her, and she says goodbye. That is me in my uniform. And that is the card that my mother gave me at the airport in Berlin when I left. It shows the date on the other side. And she says, God save you and your work, Mother. She wrote that in English. Oh, this is, after I got out of the army, I joined the Intelligence Corps Old Comrades Association. This is my lifetime membership document. This is a certificate of graduate of thanks that I got because I had been camp assistant postmaster, and it was signed by Count Lingen, who was Prince Friedrich Wilhelm von Preußen, and Colonel Briggs, the Canadian camp commandant. I got that when I left Canada. That is a most important document. That is when I became married to my girlfriend from Cottbus, Sonia, in London at the Kensington Registry Office, short time before I went to Sicily from England, on the 1st of July 1943. Oh, that shows that the name Tebrich showed up in Suffolk County in 1275 in England. Our belated wedding picture, which was taken 2 years after we got married, when I had home leave from the continent to England, and we look like, and we are, a very happy couple. And this is taken, I think, at the same time. Sonia was a nurse, I was in the army. I put my uniform back on, and after a month's home leave, I had to go back. That was our belated wedding picture and belated honeymoon. This is in the New World. In 1947, we came to America, to California. This is our daughter Jeanette, who is slightly pregnant after 9 years. She took a long time. Our son-in-law, Jeff Smith, our son Michael, our daughter-in-law Debbie, it was their wedding, Sonia and myself. There were no grandchildren at that time. Yes, there were, but they were not visible.
We're going to return to this picture for a minute. Would you tell us about this one again?
Oh, this one? This one was taken at the same time we took this. It was on that leaf that I had. And Sonia, no, it was taken after the war. When I came back, I was already on my last leave from the army. We decided that we wanted to have something if our children would ask us, Daddy, Mommy, what have you done during the war? We had no children at that time. So Sonia put on her uniform. She wasn't a nurse anymore at that time either. And I put on my uniform and we had a picture taken. Our first grandchild, Shane, that's the one who took nine years to come. And he's a beautiful boy, growing up fast. Our only granddaughter, Tiffany, and Jeanette's dog, Lady Amber of the Foothills. And this is our grandson, Tyler. He is the future basketball player, who will be well known, he tells us. And this is a picture taken at the party in what I call our third life. Our first life was in Germany, the second one in England. This is in America. We came to America in 1947, and an uncle of Sonia's had always written to us, come to America, it's the land of golden opportunities. He offered me a job in his furniture business, which I bought from him later on, in which we both operated. And this is our home country. That is our retirement story in the local newspaper. Sonia and myself, and this is in the background you see the furniture store from which we are now the Tebriches to retire. We love this country. Every time we come back from an overseas trip, we are very happy to be home again, but we'll never forget England that gave us a chance to escape. There's one more card from my sister, from Holland. No, it's on the card. You showed one side, you didn't show the other side. No.